sewing friends, and welcome back. I'm the Catsews, and today we're going to start talking about some corset making. I have a small series of videos coming out over the next 2 months or so, all about my corset making journey, which I'm very excited to share with you. So today is just going to be a really easy introduction about how I took a drawing from a book and turned it into a functional corset pattern. So this is the book in question. This is Corsets and Crinolines by Nora Waugh, I think it is, and edited by Judith Dolan. This is a fantastic book. I really think it should be a staple for a lot of people, but that being said, I don't know a lot about the corset making historical costuming world, so that's the word of a complete novice. Basically, I found this really interesting. There is a general history of supportive, like, boned garments from about the 1500s through to the 1900s. It talks about how the garments changed over time and also the production process and how that was changed. I found this to be really informative, really interesting, and there are a ton of patterns in here. They're all scalable, which is fantastic. I do think they're a little bit hard to work with, so probably not like the best beginner resource, but as an overall view of the world of like historical undergarments, I found this book to be really interesting and really invaluable, so I think it would benefit a lot of people. I should also say this book doesn't just speak to like stays and corsets, it also talks about like farthingales and crinolines, as the name suggests. So it's just an overall view of the world of supportive undergarments that basically helped create fashionable historical silhouettes as we know them today. The pattern in question that I took out of this book is this one. This is on page 73 of my edition, and it's figure 38. So I basically took this and amazingly ended up with this. This is my corset, not quite finished. There are a couple of small detail things that I want to do, but this is basically my corset. And I'm super happy with the way it turned out. I made a ton of mistakes, which I will let you know about so that hopefully you can avoid them for yourself throughout the making process. But overall, I'm super pleased with how it turned out. I'm really happy, and this, I feel, is a really big achievement. Like, I made a corset that is something so daunting in my mind that actually turned out to be a lot easier and a bit more fun than I was anticipating it to be. So, before we get into all of that, today we're just going to be focusing on the main pattern and how I developed it. I will say this is not intended to be an instructional video, like kind of yes, kind of no, because I did find that my techniques worked and that I ended up with a usable result at the end of all of it. But on the flip side, I have no idea what I'm doing. So if you are going to take my word and like follow along with what I'm doing, just a warning, I am not a professional. I don't do this for a living, and this is my first foray into a lot of things. This is my first corset, my first piece of historical sewing, the first time I've ever taken a pattern from a book and had to scale it up by myself. So there's a lot of firsts in here. So hopefully you will find a bit of help in troubleshooting along the way and maybe just some things to avoid doing. But I don't intend this to be a purely instructional video simply because I am aware that I'm very new at this and I don't necessarily think I should be telling other people what to do yet. So that being said, if you'd like to see what I did to create my corset pattern, just keep watching. So, as mentioned, my reference book for this project was Corsets and Crinolines by Nora Waugh. The pattern I used for this particular corset can be found on page 73 of my edition. It's also called figure 38, and it's described as light French stays in a white cotton with small spot flowers, trimmed lace unlined. This way of cutting from shaped pieces without gussets came in the late 1840s. It was more popular in France than England. So this corset relies entirely on the shape and cut of its panels to provide shape to the overall garment, which I thought was going to be easier to work with instead of trying to insert gussets as well. Partially correct, partially incorrect. I did find that certainly some things would have been easier with gussets, but some things also would have been easier had I just used a different kind of material. But we will get into that, don't you worry. So fortunately, all of the patterns in this book come with an associated scale. Thank goodness, because it was the only way I was going to be able to make this work. I'm sure you could actually create your own scale by just making a grid that was 1/8 of an inch and then scaling it up accordingly. But I didn't have to think too much about that one because I had a scale that I could use. Unfortunately, it didn't actually match up with any inch measurement. So an 1/8 of an inch and a little bit equated to 1 inch full size. So what I ended up doing is taking the little scale and basically tracing that and using it as a guide to create my own tiny grid on a piece of baking paper, which I then would tape to my book very, very carefully so that I did not damage my book. And then I used that grid and the grid on my cutting mat to start tracing out how the lines should be. This method was actually pretty easy to deal with. I don't know why I put it off for so long. I seriously procrastinated starting this because I was so worried that it was going to be too much of a complicated task for me. But I should have realized I kind of love doing math, so this kind of scaling up actually works really well for my brain. So, you know, future lessons for me and for everyone else watching out there, this is not hard to do. I promise you, just give it a go. As Norelle from Costuming Drama says, just do the thing. Part of the reason I made myself a separate grid on a piece of baking paper instead of just drawing it into my book was that I wanted it to be maneuverable. I wanted to be able to pick up the little grid paper that I created and realign it with each new pattern piece. And the way I did this was I basically took the corner of a tiny square and I aligned it to a corner point of each new pattern piece that I was starting. That way I had a starting point and I didn't need to try and figure out, oh, you know, this starts off at like 2/8 of an inch into this square. Which I figured if I had just drawn everything directly onto my paper, I would have ended up with weird starting points and that would have made the whole process a lot more difficult. Plus, you know, trying not to draw in my nice book, but honestly, it's a reference book, so I'm not going to hate on anyone who does do that. They're your books, you can do what you like. This method I just found made it a lot easier for me. Unfortunately, along the way I did discover that these drawings were not consistent. Like the thickness of the lines varied a little bit, so I'm pretty sure I haven't done the best job in scaling it up. I figured this out because I was looking at the boning lines in the pattern, and boning is usually just over 1/4 of an inch wide, not thick but wide, which yeah, so when you're doing your boning channels, you want them to make them just over 1/4 of an inch. So I figured that I could start using that as a reference for what was 1/4 of an inch, because while I had my tiny grid, I didn't have any additional instructions, so it was kind of eyeballing what was like 1/8 of an inch versus, you know, 1/2 an inch or 3/8 of an inch. It wasn't always consistent, so I found that using the boning channels as a 1/4 of an inch guide certainly helped, but that did also make me realize that these lines were actually pretty inconsistent. This did take me quite a few evenings to complete. It was not a quick process, but it was also a bit of an enjoyable one, and I probably would have completed this a lot quicker if I wasn't so pedantic about exactly the distances between things. But also scaling up, I think you are supposed to be a bit pedantic. So once I had all of my pattern pieces traced and cut out, I could then find how big the waist was on these. There was no waist point marked on the pattern, which was a bit terrifying, so I just kind of eyeballed it and figured the point of the greatest curve is probably the waistline. And then I just aligned them all side by side. There was no seam allowance yet to take into account, so that was fairly easy. So I just kind of joined the edges of the pattern pieces, and then I was able to measure the waist. At this point, I was terrified of these pattern pieces. They looked so small. What you definitely need to keep in mind if you're doing this yourself is you probably have an added seam allowance at this point, and seam allowance adds a lot, surprisingly a large amount. You think 5/8 of an inch all the way around, that adds up to quite a bit. Additionally, you're actually going to cut 2 of each of these, so this is only half of your pattern, which is definitely something to keep in mind. I found out that this waist was a laughable 19 inches, and considering my waist is 31 inches, not taking into account lacing down and lacing gaps and everything, I needed definitely to scale this up. Before I did anything, I wanted more durable copies to work with. So I went through and I basically just traced these onto printer paper so that I could cut these out and use the printer paper versions as my mock-up, muck around kind of scale up versions. That way I would still have my nice versions with all of my markings set aside, and they could be more of a reference point than anything else. So I took the time to do this, and I think it was definitely worthwhile. The other thing I should note here is that it is 100% worthwhile naming your pattern pieces. If you're scaling up from a book like the one I used, they're not going to have names. So I used pretty basic naming conventions. You know, I started off with my center front and my center back pieces. And then I had my side back piece and my side piece, and I actually had 2 front pieces, so I just named them front side and front side piece. Basically the way like northeast works and northeast works, if that makes sense to anybody else besides me. I found that this was really helpful for keeping track of what pieces aligned with each other. I also just kept them stacked correctly. That way, you know, it was just grab the next few pieces and they should stick together this way. And I found that was really easy to deal with once everything was labelled correctly. So once I had all of my durable, adjustable pieces traced and cut out, I could move on to scaling up my pattern pieces and figuring out how to make this corset work for me. So I mentioned that the original waist of this corset measured at 19 inches. Again, I measured this by laying all of my pieces out with the waistlines touching and measuring from there, taking into account that this only represents half of your finished corset, so I then doubled the measurement that I took. So a measurement of 9.5 inches then became 19 inches. You can do this in a little bit more of a complex fashion as well. You can additionally measure the bust and the waist points and decide on your perfect measurements from there. I would probably recommend doing it this way. I was terrified and I wanted to make it as simple for myself as possible. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and I now know that those additional measurement points would not have been too much extra work, and they certainly would have been worth it for just a better fitting corset now. But also, when I made my original mock-up, I didn't know as much about corsetry as I do now, and I still don't know much about corsetry. It's a learning process, and you're allowed to make mistakes. So I measured my waistline. It came out as 19 inches. I then needed to figure out how many additional inches I needed to add to my corset in order to make it fit me. So my natural waist is 31 inches. The standard waist reduction amount for a corset is said to be 2 inches.
This varies greatly from person to person, so this will not always be the same. Some people can lace down very comfortably, and I'm not talking about tight lacing. Say it again for the people in the back. I'm not talking about tight lacing. I'm sorry if you can hear background noise right now. My cat is being very grumpy and just wandering around yowling, and I don't know what he wants. He probably wants some food, but it's too early for dinner. It is. It's too early. Anyway, back to it. So basically the space in between your hips and your ribs, that like squishy flesh area, that's what allows you to lace down. The space between my hips and my ribs is actually pretty small. I think I have long legs but a bit of a shorter torso, but I'm still tall, so it's a weird, bodies are strange. So yes, I don't have that much space between my hips and my ribs. So even though with a corset on I do get a very standard hourglass shape, my lacing, the amount that I can lace down is not actually very large at all. Which I didn't know until I had tried on a properly made corset. Anyway, we've gotten a bit off track here. The point is, standard estimate for how much you will lace down in a corset is 2 inches. And you also want a 2-inch lacing gap in the back. So your ideal corset waist measurement should be 4 inches smaller than your actual waist. So for me, working with a 31-inch waist, I should be making a corset with a measurement of 27 inches. Again, I want to emphasize that we are not talking about tight lacing. Do not lace more than is comfortable. There is no reason for it. Corsets are there for like shape, not to like squish you. Well, they will squish you a little bit, but we're not talking about tight lacing. And again, this is kind of the ideal. This measurement will not work for everybody. You've just got to do some mock-ups and figure out what does work for your body. So from here, I figured, well, if I need a 27-inch measurement on my corset waist, then I need to add 8 inches to it. So which seam lines am I adding this to? I am not adding any inches to my center front seam or my center back seam. I couldn't tell you why, honestly. It made sense to me at the time, but there's no rule saying that you can't. So I basically counted up all of the remaining seams and I divided my 8 inches by how many seams I had, and I just added a little bit of width to each seam. While I was doing this, I also added my seam allowance. I went with my standard 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters, and I just added those as I went. And that is it. That is how I took a corset pattern from a book and turned it into a fully functional thing, ready for mock-ups.
And that's it. That is how I took a pattern or a drawing out of a book and turned it into a corset pattern. Over the next 2 videos, we're going to be exploring how I actually made my corset and showing you what I did and what I did wrong, because what I did wrong, there's a lot of what I did wrong, but that's fine, you know, that's about learning. Anyway, that will be coming in the next video. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you guys have any questions, please leave them down below. Additionally, if you have any advice or any tips and tricks for me and other people out there watching this, please feel welcome to leave that down below as well. I'm sure that I and many other people would find that really helpful. Thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!